Chapter 15. Simon returned with the desire to be alone with his racing thoughts. He greeted his family and then begged them all to save the questions for later. Julius instantly recognized their son and returned with a heavy burden and ushered them all away. They all protested as Julius insisted they leave Simon in peace, but Julius became unusually stern with them. Sawyer simply gave her son a hug before she followed the whole family out. Simon kept walking until he found himself on the rooftop of the palace. He found two cushioned thrones perfectly perched to see the entire kingdom below. It had begun to grow dark when he was in the other realm with the gods, and the cooking fires began to light the night sky as he watched. Thousands of cooking fires lit up the night sky as he became lost in his own thoughts. He searched the night sky for the constellations his father had taught him as a child. He wished he could go back, if only for a single night, and let his father show him the stars once more. He felt a single tear fall down his cheek as he looked up. He heard someone approach and was surprised to see it was Taya. Seeing her in the moonlight, he realized she was even more beautiful than Vishu. She walked to him and leaned down slightly. With her thumb, she gently wiped away his tear. She let her hand linger on his face and asked, "Are you all right?" in a gentle tone. He nodded his head yes, because suddenly his throat was closed with emotion. Even as he nodded, another tear fell from his eyes to wet her hand. She stood before him and grabbed his hands. She wrapped them around her waist and gently guided his hand to lay on her stomach. She stroked his hair softly and his tears flowed freely then. When he could finally cry no more tears, he let her continue to stroke his hair and remained in her comforting embrace. It seemed all time had stopped in her arms. She finally took his hands from her waist and into her own. She pulled him to stand up but did not let go. "Come, it's time to see what you weep for," she said, and waved in a door that they walked through. They were standing in a lush meadow by a tiny house made of straw and mud. A young girl stepped out of it, and Simon instantly recognized her. "What is this, Taya?" he asked, dreading what he was about to see. "This is my beginning, Simon. This is the home in which I grew to the age of 17. This little shack was a place filled with love, and I was raised by people who loved me more than their own lives. My father built this home for us far away from the village to keep us safe," she answered, and saw herself in a way she hadn't in a very long time. She saw the happiness on the face of the girl she had once been. She watched as the girl tilted her face to the sun and let the warmth of it touch her skin. She remembered how she used to love the first touch of the sun in the morning. It had once brought her joy. "Keep you safe from what?" Simon asked, watching the young girl intently. "Men. My father knew we were poor and held no station. I was a pretty young girl, and anything could be done to me or my family without consequence of law," she said. The girl picked up a basket from beside the tiny fence that held a goat in it. She headed for the tree line nearby. Simon and Taya followed her, unseen, and began to walk into the forest. "I used to come here and gather mushrooms and berries for our meals. My younger brother would usually come with me to check his traps. We would spend all afternoon in the forest gathering what food we could find. He usually trapped small rabbits and sometimes a bird. This day, however, he was sick with a fever and had stayed home. It was what would make me wander off farther than usual to check his traps for him." Simon noticed a group of young men thrashing about in a large thicket of ferns when Taya happened upon them. One young man looked up and, seeing this beautiful girl alone in the woods, flashed her a smile. He had just shot a bird from a tree and it had fallen into the heavy growth here. I had never met anyone from outside of my own family before. When strangers came too near our house, my father would make us all hide inside. He would claim he lived there alone and never offered hospitality. I had never understood what he protected us from, but I would come to understand. The handsome young man approached her and began to charm the naive young girl immediately. He leaned against a tree as she blushed and laughed. Taya waved her hand sideways, and the scene began to fast forward. Simon watched as the young girl fell madly in love with the handsome young man. I didn't know he was a prince. I didn't know he was seducing me. I truly believed all the lies he spewed from his mouth. Lying came so easily to him that I was caught up in this daydream of feelings. I told him all of my secrets, and I shared my feelings with him freely. I had never been taught to be guarded with my heart. I had never been taught to be ashamed of what I had, and so I showed him my home from a distance. I remember him laughing at the time, but I thought it was out of happiness and not cruelty. She fast-forwarded again, and now Simon saw she had grown heavy with child. He watched as she waited day after day for him to return to her side. She watched as her parents wept at the knowledge of what had happened to her. She waited and she watched. All the while she sang to the child inside of her. She was so full of joy, no matter the circumstances, at the life she had created. He grew tired of me, as men are prone to do. As soon as the thrill of the chase was gone, so was he. He came less often after he found new women to pursue, but like a dog with a buried bone, he still came occasionally. I would have been lucky if he had just forgotten about me and never came back, Taya told him with bitterness in her voice. She remembered how his mood was prone to sudden change. One minute he would be saying sweet things, and with the next breath he would cut her down with his words. The beginning had been filled with words of love and understanding. After he had conquered her heart, though, he set out to destroy it. Only his own feelings and opinion mattered, and when she was left, after every encounter, more and more confused. She looked now as he approached the young woman and wondered how she had been so naive. He was always dressed so well, although he told her his father was a farmer. She noticed his hands were always clean and soft, but didn't question this even though her own were rough and calloused. The sight of him, even though he had died long ago, made her blood boil. She wanted to go and shake the girl and tell her the truth. The truth would have been far less painful. Simon watched as he rode up and saw she carried his child. He was furious with her and began yelling. When she tried to seek the comfort of his arms, he knocked her to the ground and rode off. She yelled after him, but he was unmoved by her words or her tears. She was hurt and confused by his reaction, and lay on the ground and wept. I couldn't understand his reaction at the time. When my mother had carried my brother in her belly, my father was overjoyed. He had oftentimes put his hands around her stomach and told her of his happiness. The young prince, however, was anything but overjoyed. He had accused me of trying to force him to marry me. He said I was trying to improve my station and trick him with my fake declarations of love. To be honest, I had believed he would marry me, and we would raise a family on his farm. It had seemed to me the next step in our love, and I still believed in his words long after his actions had shown me something entirely different. When he first stopped coming, my father would follow me out here every day as I waited for him. Eventually, my father gave up and assumed he would not be back. When I first became pregnant, my father had spoken of us leaving and making our home somewhere safer. He relaxed when he thought that my young lover would never return. She knew now its time had come to show Simon what had been done to her to make her immortal. She forwarded to the dark of night, and they walked up to the cloth covering the opening of her childhood home. She reached out to pull it aside and looked at him with despair. Before they stepped in, she whispered, "I have never returned to this night before." He reached out his hand and took hers. "We don't have to, Taya." She looked at him, her eyes full of sadness for what he was about to witness. "You must see what the humans are capable of, Simon," she said, and stepped forward, pulling him in with her. Inside the small dwelling, a few burning embers left from the night's fire were all the light to see by. It was so small, though, that they cast enough light to see clearly. It was just one room. A makeshift table had been pushed up to the wall to provide space for sleeping. 4 tree logs were used as seating and then put into the center to divide the room into 2 sleeping areas. On one side slept Taya's parents, and on the other slept Taya and her young brother. They shared a sleeping mat laid on top of the dirt floor. Each had a thin, dirty blanket to cover themselves with. Simon looked down at the young Taya and saw on her face an innocence she no longer possessed, and he wondered if she even remembered herself this way. She was on her side, and even in sleep she cradled her belly lovingly. Simon watched in horror as the prince and 2 of his men entered the home where she slept quietly. He watched as they butchered her whole family while she screamed and begged for him to stop. Even in that moment, she still believed he had some decency in him. He had saved her death for last and stood over her to deliver the killing blows. This is when my soul shattered. It did not matter. It did not shatter as he killed my family, or even as he killed me and his own child, she said. and Simon watched as he laughed while the blood from her splattered all over him, and he kept driving his sword down on her. It was that he took so much joy in this act. Only at the last moment did I finally realize what he truly was, and that knowledge broke me, she said. They stepped outside after the 4 men were done and saw one of them throw up on the ground at the sight of what they had just done. They watched as the prince set fire to the home and sighed with relief as it burned. Taya watched as her tiny home burned with all that she had ever loved inside of it. Simon saw the tears now flowed down her face, and he took her in his arms to return the comfort he had needed earlier. He realized how hard this must have been to come here. She had never come here before, and only returned so he could witness what humans were capable of. She now relaxed into his arms and allowed herself to grieve for everything lost on this night so long ago. She let herself imagine for just a moment her child running through the meadow and picking dandelions. The child raised its face to the sun and let the warmth touch it. She then let the image of the child she would never know fade as the sun overtook it, and she could no longer see anything besides the brightness of the sun in her mind. She shook herself from all thoughts and pulled away from Simon. She waved in the door and they stepped through. They were on a busy street full of smells and noises coming from all around them. They stood in a courtyard that was walled off. The courtyard held cooking areas and a well. Apartments stood towering above the courtyard, and the stone stairs that led up to them looked freshly laid. People walked all around them, cooking and washing clothes. Others hung out of the windows from above and gossiped with neighbors below. A small boy came walking through the gate and began to climb the stairs. His little legs made the journey hard, and he stumbled dangerously a couple times. Taya took his hand, and they began to follow the child. Simon thought the little boy looked familiar, but could not place him. He entered an apartment, and they followed him in. The inside of the apartment was made entirely of cement, and offered only a common area and 2 rooms. Fabric hung over the 2 rooms to offer privacy. The common room held a table and chairs, and a couple of chairs around the fireplace. The little boy entered the house, and immediately a small girl ran over to him. A tall man was yelling at a woman, and the girl had meant to shield him from what was happening. She tried to scoot him into one of the curtained rooms unnoticed, but the man noticed him. Another small boy came out of the room, and Simon suddenly understood why he had recognized the boy. He was looking at his father as a child. His Aunt Cassie and Uncle Marcus were trying to distract their father from Julius, but he had set his sights on the child. He began to hit the young boy mercilessly, and the child began to cry. Simon had wanted to intervene. The sight of his father being abused enraged him, and he stepped forward. Taya held his arm to pull him back. "This has already happened. You cannot stop it," she told him. Simon averted his eyes as the young boy was struck over and over. He felt the rage inside him growing, but it had no place to go. "Do not look away. Your father suffered great pain in his lifetime at the hands of this man. He paid for your mother's affair with another lover," Taya told him, forcing him to look up again at the tiny child his father had once been. "Why did you bring me here?" he asked her angrily. "To show you what humans do. This cruelty inflicted upon your father wasn't the exception, it's the rule. The humans have abused one another so terribly throughout the ages. Your own family has been touched by it. It is their nature," she explained. He waved in a door as Cassie began to plead with their father to stop. He could see no more. They stood on the rooftop of the palace once again. The cooking fires had been extinguished and the night was silent. They stood together at the edge of the rooftop, looking out across the land. Finally, Simon placed his hand on top of Taya's. "Thank you for showing me what happened to you and to my father," he said quietly, not looking at her, but continuing to stare out into the night. She also continued to look forward, but made no effort to remove his hand from hers. "I wanted to show you how much pain humans cause. Every day since the beginning of time has seemed like this happens in some part of this world. The humans are not content to let one day pass without pain in it. I saw from the moment I met you that your parents were like mine and kept you sheltered from it. I know learning your purpose has caused you a heavy weight to carry. I hope that seeing this frees you from some of that burden. You may save the humans, or you may choose to have them destroyed. Remember this night if that time ever comes to make the decision," she told him. They stood together for the rest of the night, not speaking another word, just standing in comfortable silence while Simon gathered his thoughts. When the sun began to peek out from the horizon, both of them realized they did not want the night to end. Sawyer raised an eyebrow when she saw Simon in walking with Taya. She had gone to check on him in the night and found his room empty. When she had checked again this morning, his room remained untouched. She had to admit he looked better than he had yesterday when he had returned from meeting with the gods. She watched as he walked straight to his father and hugged him. His arms were tight around Julius's neck, the way they had been when he was a small child and hugged his father. Julius held his son tightly in his arms, not knowing why Simon held him this way, although he understood his son needed to. Sawyer also noticed that he and Taya seemed more at ease with each other. Whatever had happened to Simon yesterday had left an impact on him. She wondered how long it would last. He came to sit at the round table by his mother and began to eat what the servants were setting in front of him. Sawyer looked at him and asked him, "Are you ready to tell us what happened yesterday?" He swallowed the food he had been chewing and said, "Not yet," and she nodded, understanding. Celine stood up from the table and spoke loudly to everyone as they ate. "Ra and I have been discussing something with Cassia, but I will let her tell you," Celine said excitedly, and everyone turned to stare at Cassia. Cassia stood up and smiled at everyone. She had changed so much since meeting Lucas. She smiled more freely now and seemed to be filled with happiness all the time. As she began to speak, she practically beamed. "Ra has graciously offered for Lucas and I to be married here at the palace, and we have agreed," she told everyone. "That sounds so romantic," Harlow cried out in glee. "We thought the courtyard would make the perfect setting for the wedding," Ra announced, and Sawyer noticed he seemed almost excited too. Julius and Marcus came over to shake Lucas's hand and offer congratulations on the announcement. Everyone gathered around the couple to congratulate them, and Sawyer's concern for Simon was pushed to the back of her mind for a while. Later, Celine walked in the garden with Sawyer as she surveyed the area to see what plants grew. She would transform the area into a garden overflowing with beautiful flowers for Cassia's wedding. "I see you and Ra have become fast friends," Sawyer told her. "Yes, he says he's drawn to me and my energy. He told me when he was a child that people like us were killed publicly," Celine told her. "Is he like you?" Sawyer asked, not knowing how to phrase it correctly. "Sort of. He's not exactly like me, though. I was born a female in a male's body. He was born both male and female. He was called androgynous in his time. His father made him be raised as a boy because he was heir to the throne, but his female side was hard to mask. He is strong like a man, but as beautiful as any woman could hope to be. It is why he is immortal now. His father decided to have him killed when a new male heir was born," Celine explained. "His own father? That's awful," Sawyer exclaimed. "Yes, he said the pain of his father betraying him shattered his soul," Celine answered sadly. They walked on for a few more minutes, neither of them knowing what to say after the terrible revelation. Finally, Celine said quietly, "He asked me to stay here with him when you all go back." She waited for Sawyer's reaction. Sawyer stopped abruptly and turned to her new friend. "What was your answer?" she asked. "I told him I would think about it. I love him, but not in a traditional way. I love his soul and he loves mine. We had an instant connection, and I feel like I've known him my whole life. It's like I found the missing piece of myself with him, only it's so much more. It's just hard to explain," Celine said, frustrated, because she couldn't explain how perfect she felt when she was with him. He was not only accepted both her male and female side, but also had his own. Their energies were in perfect sync, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely understood. Sawyer looked at her friend, understanding the inability to explain how she felt. "Celine, that sounds very rare indeed. You must cherish that love with your whole being. I hope you're happy here," she said, knowing that Celine had already made up her mind. "Well, they do have great wigs here, and the clothing is fit for a queen," she answered excitedly, and realized she had just made her decision. Harlow could hear a soft melody being played, and the sound of it tugged at her soul. She spent an hour looking for its source, and finally found Lucas tucked in a small room, tapping away on a piano. The sound had floated on the wind to her and beckoned a reaction. She smiled as she approached. Lucas was so involved in the melody he hadn't noticed her yet. She knew he wouldn't feel her presence until she sat next to him. She had grown up watching Lucas play, and even been taught by him. No one could match his intense love for music, though. They had all known as children to go to the music room if they had something important they could only talk to Uncle Lucas about. Their mother had told them once that Lucas could feel the vibration of the music like a fae. When they saw him play, they all agreed. She slid onto the bench next to him, and he finally noticed her. "Where on earth did you get a piano in ancient Egypt?" she asked, not really surprised because Lucas could find a piano anywhere. He looked up and made a note on the sheet and answered, "These immortals can get anything you want. I'm sure if you needed a place to go clubbing, they could make it happen." She laughed. "Can you imagine a nightclub in the middle of this desert? I wonder if the locals would come check it out or if the techno would scare them all off," she said. "I think teenagers are the same no matter what century they live in. You would be dancing all night," he said, laughing at the thought of Harlow dancing with the ancient Egyptian boys. "What is this music you're writing? It's absolutely beautiful," she asked after they finished laughing. "I want to write a song for Cassia for the wedding. I have this tune stuck in my head, but for the life of me, no words will come. No matter how long I sit and play, it's blank," he told her. "Would you mind if I help? I have a song stuck in my head, but no tune will come out. When I heard your music, it seemed perfectly. Besides, I would love to help make Aunt Cassie a song," Harlow told him. "Let's hear what you have and see if they mesh," Lucas said, and began to play. They found the melody and the song were in perfect harmony together. They had no idea what they were creating. Aiden found Hannah sitting outside alone. He looked at her and understood that even as her bruises were healing, her heart was not. Betrayal was the most painful of all heartbreaks, and he wondered how humans could be so careless with one another. They would claim to love one another, but then they began to hate the thing they claimed to love. There was no mercy in humans' love, especially the young ones. The older ones would learn the lessons of love over time, but the young were cruel when it came to matters of the heart. She sat looking out over the vast landscape. Miles of sand looked back at her, and she could find no joy. Even when Cassie had announced the wedding, she had to fake her smile. She felt broken and was scared she would never be put back together. It wasn't just that Derek hadn't loved her. That would have been bad enough, but she was naive. Harlow had warned her, but she hadn't listened to the one person who always shared an energy with her. They had felt when something wasn't right with the other one, and this time Hannah had chosen to ignore the twins' intuition. She hadn't been blinded by Derek. She had let herself be blinded by her own heart. That was the worst pain of this whole ordeal. She no longer trusted herself. She saw Aiden approach, and even though she was heartbroken, she could still appreciate how gorgeous he was. He smiled that infectious grin at her, and she had to finally smile back. This smile was genuine. "Have you ever ridden a camel before?" he asked, leaning down so they were eye level. "Of course not," she answered, flabbergasted by the question. "Then your life changes today," he said enthusiastically. "There is nothing more exhilarating than the sand and the wind whipping through your hair as the camel races freely." She started laughing at how ridiculous it all sounded. He stood up and extended his hand to her. "Come, let's keep that smile from fading." She looked at his hand warily, and her smile quickly faded. He kept his hand extended. "I will never hurt you, and I will destroy anyone that ever tries to again," he said gently. "I no longer trust myself," she said in a whisper. Now he bent back down to her and spoke. "That wasn't you, Hannah. You became what you thought he wanted, but that was never truly you. Do not trust that girl again, but trust the one who sits before me now. You must be true to yourself before you can be true to another," he told her. She looked into his eyes and noticed they were pale brown with gold flecks. He was the ruler of the underworld, a place full of demons and nightmares, yet he had the gentlest touch when he was with her, and she realized a person could be both, strong and yet gentle, fierce and yet mild, deadly and yet nurturing. Her smile returned, and she reached for his hand, never taking her eyes from his. He smiled back and pulled her up. Marcus found Paul in the great library. He had been looking at ancient scrolls, but even though they were open, Paul was staring into space, daydreaming. Marcus knew Paul was never distracted and had laser focus when it came to studying anything. He was not prone to his mind wandering. He would normally be devouring the ancient hieroglyphs that had been lost to time. who would be scribbling notes and waiting impatiently to tell Marcus what he had found. Marcus was even more surprised when Paul didn't even notice when he came in. "What has consumed your thoughts?" Marcus asked, startling the young man out of whatever daydream he had been lost in. Paul shook his head at the question. "Not sure," he said, sounding confused. "Then maybe I can help you solve the puzzle. What were you thinking about the moment before I interrupted you?" Marcus asked, growing concerned by Paul's behavior and elusiveness. "Nothing," Paul said, looking embarrassed. Marcus nodded, understanding. "Was it all three of them, or just one in particular?" Marcus asked knowingly. Paul blushed at his secret being spoken out loud, but was glad it was Marcus who had asked. If anyone else had asked, he wouldn't have spoken about it. But Marcus was like a father to him. "All three," he answered, blushing. Marcus had been suspicious about it, but now it was confirmed. The first day he had come back from meeting them, he had seen the change in Paul. He had always been so enthusiastic about learning something new, but the Furies had been different. He had talked about them with such care and looked awestruck when he spoke. The Furies were beautiful and no man could resist them. They had turned into dark fae, but when they were around Paul he would catch a glimpse of the fae they had once been. Paul was able to see both the dark and the light in them, and Marcus was sure they had never shown anyone both sides still existed until they met Paul. "I know it's crazy, but I missed them," Paul admitted. Marcus studied the young man for a minute. He knew he could warn him away from the Furies like everyone else had, but what good would that do? He would only alienate him, and then Paul would feel alone in his feelings. He would think he had no one to turn to. "Crazier things have happened," he reassured him. "Maybe, but Uncle Marcus, they're all insane," Paul said defeatedly. Paul had given much thought to the Furies and had determined, even though he might care for them, they were indeed insane. They had been driven to madness and turned dark because they were so traumatized. They would never be the same again. "They are not crazy, Paul, they are broken," Marcus answered, thinking of the beautiful Necia. "I can't fix them," Paul exclaimed, frustrated by this fact, knowing if he could he already would have. "You don't fix what you love, Paul. You love it despite its broken parts. Do you remember when you were a little boy and you had that teddy bear? Patches was its name, I believe," Marcus said. Paul smiled, remembering his favorite toy as a child, and nodded at Marcus. "You would carry it around with you everywhere, and when it started to tear at the seams, you would sneak into the Fae realm and beg the Fae to fix it. For years we would tuck you into bed with it, and you would sneak it in your book bag to school. Every time it had to be repaired, it looked less and less like it had in the beginning. Yet no matter how tattered it became, you loved it the same. Its broken and missing parts didn't bother you. You continued to love it. It's the same when you love another person. The tattered and missing parts don't matter. You love them the way they are, the way they've been pieced back together," Marcus counseled, knowing if Paul loved the Furies, the road ahead would not be easy. "I don't think I know how to do that, Uncle Marcus. I've never been in a relationship before, and I'm not sure I could love them the way they need to be loved," Paul answered dejectedly. "Yet you stand here doing exactly that, despite believing you don't know how," Marcus told him, and Paul realized he was right. Julius and Simon were outside sparring with practice swords. Julius understood that something weighed heavily on his son's mind. He also understood he would come to him when he was ready. When Simon had been young, he had begun to use their sparring time as a time to speak alone with his father. Whenever he had a problem now, he would ask Julius to spar, and Julius would wait patiently until Simon began to speak. Simon held his father's opinion in every matter above anyone else's. He had never made a decision without first getting his father's opinion. As the swords clacked against each other, Simon finally began to speak. "Did you hate your father?" Simon asked him. "Yes," Julius answered, and swung his sword. "Did you wish him dead?" asked Simon, and blocked the hit. "Every day," Julius answered, and began to wonder where this was heading. "Why then did you not kill him?" Simon asked, and was caught off balance because his father stopped his swing midair, and Simon's blocking move caused him to stumble. Julius looked at his son and thought of the answer to this question. "I should have, but I could never find the courage to do it. It wasn't until you were born that I finally understood what a father should feel for the child. I guess by the time I had been able to understand all things, he was already dead and gone. Julius was always honest with Simon, and admitting for the first time in centuries he had never been able to stop his own abuser was difficult. Julius believed, however, that honesty was what Simon needed more than anything right now. Do you think humans love war?" asked Simon. "I think humans have three concerns: flesh, food, and fighting. They will wage war for flesh and food because their nature is towards violence. I have never lived in a decade that a war was not being waged in some part of the world. So to answer your question, yes, I believe they love war," Julius said. "I understand food, but what do you mean by flesh?" Simon asked. "Humans would dominate the flesh of others. They would own another man's body, or they would take from a woman's body what they desire. Flesh consumes their fantasies, and their fantasies are full of pain and violence." "Could you imagine yourself owning another?" Julius asked. "No, I couldn't," Simon admitted. "Nor could I. And yet, even today, humans own others. They debase other humans like they are no better than cattle. They buy and sell what they consider their property. And do you know why it has always existed and will continue to exist?" Julius asked him. Simon nodded, realizing he did not know the answer. "No, why?" "Not because they don't know what they do is wrong. They continue to own other people because there will always be stronger, more powerful people. These people will never stop, Simon," Julius told him, thinking of all the centuries when people were openly bought and sold as a common practice. Now the practice was left to the men of the world, who practiced it behind closed doors, and yet it still continued to flourish. Julius knew that whatever else Simon might need to know about humans, this was the most important thing for him to learn. Simon looked at him, letting the full magnitude of what Julius was saying sink in. "Do you think they would be ever satisfied with what they have in stock?" he asked. "The humans' need for violence can never be satisfied. They could own everything in the world and still want more. They do not fight to satisfy their needs. They fight to satisfy an appetite that can never be fed enough. That is why we practice today with these swords. The only true kindness we can give them is a quick death," Julius said, and swung again. As Simon raised his sword to block his father's blow, he finally understood what he must do.